Good evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other tonight on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in the place now known as Sydney, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be here with us this evening. Welcome. My name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales, and it's my pleasure tonight to bring to you this edition of History Matters. History Matters is a collaboration of the Professional Historians Association of New South Wales and ACT and the Oral History Association of New South Wales, and it is hosted by the State Library. Tonight we're talking all things crime and history, specifically crime histories and the Australian story. To do that, we've got two fabulous speakers for you this evening, Nerida Campbell and Andy Kaladelfos, researchers and scholars in this area that I am sure you all know quite well through their work, if not personally. We'll have plenty of time at the end of the session to answer your questions of both Nerida and Andy. And to do that, if you can just pop your question in the chat feature in Zoom, and we'll come to those after both of the presentations this evening. So first up, it is Nerida Campbell, and Nerida is a curator from Sydney Living Museums, and she has for the past 20 years worked very closely with collections that focus on New South Wales criminal, policing and court histories. Her very elegant interpretations of these often complex stories have been revealed in books and, of course, in exhibitions. Thanks so much, Nerida, for coming along tonight.
Thank you, Rachel. So I studied as a historian at the University of Sydney a very long time ago, but the thing that I found really engaging was crime history. And the thing I like about crime history is how accessible it is to so many different people. Crime is one of those things that so many of our audiences find really easy to engage with. They have an understanding of what crime is, they consume it through books, they consume it in newspapers, online, on the television, and they feel like it's something that's very easy for them to understand and to grapple with. Sometimes crime history is seen as the poor man's history, you know, grubby rubbernecking. I don't see it that way. You know, sometimes the publications that are out there that deal with crime history can just be more narratives drawn from newspapers that lack context or analysis, but I don't think that's the best way for us to speak to our audiences about crime history. And tonight I just wanted to talk about some examples from my work as a curator with Sydney Living Museums, and in particular my work at the Justice and Police Museum. So this is the Justice and Police Museum. It's made up of 3 buildings, so 2 court buildings and a former police station. The buildings are from the 1850s and the 1880s, and they're intimately linked to early policing, and indeed some senior police officers speak about this area as being the spiritual heart of policing. The remit for our collection is to collect for all of New South Wales around the themes of crime, policing and courts. The museum has about 10,000 objects, and they're everything from forensic evidence through to policing paraphernalia. And we're also home to the New South Wales Police Forensic Photography Archive, and that has about 130,000 negatives that have been created by New South Wales Police during the course of their investigations from 1910 through to 1964. So I thought I'd focus on this part of the question for tonight: how can crime history be presented to the public? So we tell stories through objects, narratives, films, oral histories, buildings and images at the Justice and Police Museum. And we tell it through lots of different forms, so exhibitions, programming, recreations, and publications. It's a challenging area to work in. We always try to keep in mind and at the forefront the idea of avoiding causing harm, hurt, or embarrassment to victims of crime and their families. We're also really keenly interested in community standards, and we hold workshops to get an idea of how we tell stories, how the community expects us to tell stories, and where the line is that we perhaps should not cross. There are so many sensitivities around crime histories. You know, these are personal stories. And the dignity of victims and their families is something that we really need to consider. It can be difficult to predict what people think is acceptable when telling stories of crime and, you know, what they think is unacceptable. So for instance, a few years ago, the Museum of London did an exhibition, Crime Museum Uncovered, and they thought very carefully and tested a lot of ethical assumptions around what they could show and what they couldn't show within that exhibition. And they were very careful about how they showed forensic evidence in particular and crime scene photography. But after all of that care, the thing that most members of the public responded most strongly to were the nooses they had on display, and they had multiple nooses on display. That was the thing that really caused a visceral reaction in the majority of their audience, and it was something that they hadn't necessarily predicted. Just as at the Justice and Police Museum, I have 3 buildings that I work in and we curate. There are places within those spaces that people find really difficult to deal with. So for instance, in the old police station, the corridor outside the cells is a space that many people balk at. One of the most common questions I get asked is, have you seen any ghosts here? So it can be difficult, and I would have thought that maybe some of the exhibitions, the forensic evidence that we had on display would cause people more discomfort than the actual physicality of the building. But one thing I've learned curating crime for such a long time is that you can never predict what people are going to respond to. Many of the objects in the collection are disquieting, and this is one of our older displays called the Crime Museum, and in it we have images taken from the Long Bay collection of people who've been convicted of various crimes, and we have objects associated with the New South Wales Police's original Crime Museum, which was formed in 1910. The curators who put together this display took a sort of taxonomic way of looking at things, so different types of guns, different types of knives and other kinds of weapons displayed without any real kind of contextual history around them. It does become problematic for me. I find that sometimes this can lead to this idea of fetishizing of the object without contextualizing it around the crime. Sometimes it can be the object that people really sort of focus on, and they forget the stories of the victims or the social circumstances that may have led to the crime. So we try, when we're displaying these kinds of objects and telling these kinds of crime stories, to think very carefully about the language we use, to think very carefully about how the victim of the crime might be presented, and even within the museum context when telling crime history, we think about lights, the colours that we use. Should blood red ever be used in a museum telling a story about murder? Those kinds of questions often come up when we're thinking about things. Also, when we're displaying images like crime scene images on screen to tell a story as part of a narrative, how long do we leave an image up? How big should the image be? Should colour be taken out of images that show wounds or other kinds of things that might distress people? So there's a lot of thought given to how to present a disquieting object that is part of a crime history. We also have to look at the reasons why people are interested in hearing stories about crime and crime history. Sometimes it's about curiosity, sometimes perhaps about catharsis, a form of release. Other people like to sort of almost learn, almost so they could safeguard themselves about, you know, against these things happening to them. And these are sort of challenges to understand, what is it that people hope to get from it? How can we present it? And how can we present it in a way that's meaningful and not just feeding in perhaps to this idea of rubbernecking So for instance, here's an image of a police officer who has been shot, affecting arrest. He was okay afterwards, but putting this kind of image into some of our histories and into some of our exhibitions can be helpful to the public, for them to sort of begin to understand not just the person committing the crime, but also the victims and the impact that it might have had on the police involved in these situations, but also to have an emotional connection. I mean, this image and the emotion that's captured in this image does help to tell those stories and get people to reflect on the role of police in a civil society. Crime history can be really useful in that some of the stories that we're able to tell through this are stories that are not traditionally told in history books, or sometimes crime history allows us to challenge some of the myths that people hold to be true. So this is an image that relates to illegal abortion in Sydney during the 1950s. And as you can see, there's an array of medical instruments there on the table. Most people who see this kind of image, or most people who think about illegal abortion or backyard abortion think about coat hangers and nasty kinds of outcomes. And certainly in our collection, we do have evidence of that, but we also have evidence of a different kind of tradition where, particularly after the Second World War, we see really well-trained doctors coming into Australia from other countries. Their qualification hasn't been recognised, and some of them work as abortionists. And it's an abortion where proper instruments are used, surgical techniques are used properly, and there's sterilisation and care for the patient, which perhaps challenges the way many people think of illegal abortion in Australia during that period. So crime can sometimes give us an opportunity to open up and expand on some of those hidden histories. When dealing with crime, particularly in the context I deal with crime stories, which is in a museum, I have to think of a lot of different audiences, and one of those audiences is children. So we have families who come into the museums, we have students who come in, and we have children who come in with a range of different adults. And that's always a tricky thing, the sensitivity around how do we tell crime history to younger people. And the way I tend to try to tell that history is through doing rather than talking to the young people. So we have programs where we talk about the history of fingerprinting, and as you can see in the top right corner, the young girl is actually learning how to fingerprint herself and use different techniques for comparing and analysing it. In the bottom right, we have some senior high school students who are learning about how courts work, and they're running a mock trial on a drug driving charge. And we sometimes have the involvement of New South Wales police prosecutors so that they actually get a very realistic experience and understanding of that. And the little toothless terror that you can see on the left of the screen is participating in our Bushrangers Behind Bars program, which we run on the weekends. It's a way of telling a history narrative to younger children and families without it being too threatening. They get dressed up, they learn how the court works, all of the roles are filled by children or families, and they get a sense of how courts work without perhaps being bored with the details of the judge sits here, the magistrate does this, there's a difference between where the defendant sits, and that kind of information isn't overwhelming for them. They learn by doing. Crime history also allows for some fairly intimate connections, and it's one of the things that can be quite challenging working with this kind of history. History is not dead for some of the people who come into the museum with questions. So, for instance, we quite often get questions from people who whose families have unresolved tensions, untold stories, and they're looking for answers. So quite often the scenario that I'll hear is, I was doing some searching on Trove and a picture came up from your collection and I think it might be my granddad, and I'd like some more information. So it's about being able to share quite intimate histories with people that can affect their lives today. So for instance, we've had people who knew that a person who knew that their granddad had gone to jail, and the family never talked about it. It was a source of very deep shame, and that person assumed that the granddad had been a murderer. But in fact, when 50 years later they did the research into that part of the history, they discovered that he went to prison for quite a low-level theft, and it had shaped their family and had shaped their understanding of their family to such a degree that it became quite a relief for them to actually find this new history. So those intimate connections with the history and with crime histories is something that I think is really interesting and accessible. You don't need to have done a history degree to be able to find out this kind of information using the crime sources. Crime history also gives us an opportunity to think about society at large, the things that change. So this is an image of a car accident with, the grille of the car with quite an unusual face drawn on it. And it's one of a series that was used by the police to begin talking about speed, drinking, and how they impact on, the accidents on the road. And I suppose through crime history, we can begin to look at things like what changes happen in legislation and how they then impact on the safety of the public at large. So we have a gallery that looks at when seatbelts were introduced, when random breath testing was introduced, when drug testing was introduced, and through graphs we can look at historically how numbers of people injured on the roads fell as a result of the police saying this is a problem, the coroner's court agreeing, and that going on to create change in the law, which has been beneficial to the people of the state. Other things within crime history and within the museum collection stay the same. This is quite an unusual object. It's cockfighting spurs, and they're hidden in a wallet. The wallet's made from the cover of a Bible, which somebody's used to disguise them as they were going out to illegal cockfights. And cockfighting is something that you don't hear a lot about in society, but in terms of the museum collection, we have example after example after example of this barbarian sport. Going right back to the 1930s, we have collected samples of these cockfighting spurs and training kits used to run this illegal sport. So again, we can sort of see the trends and changes and the things that remain the same when it comes to crime and criminal behaviour through studying this kind of history. This is an image from the New South Wales Police Forensic Photography collection. It's a young woman called Edna Lindsay, and for me, yes, there's a value in this image aesthetically. It's a pretty image, but I prefer to, as a historian, contextualise these stories of the people who appear in these images. I think it's fitting for them and for the victims of crime associated with some of these images. So in this case, Edna Lindsay is a young girl working as a typist in an office in the city, and during the 1920s we saw an increasing number of young women taking these kinds of office roles. She was tempted by her boyfriend, who was described as a jazz hall lounger. He was up to no good, didn't have a job. He tempted her to steal a cheque from her employer, and they forged a signature and got caught when it was presented at the bank. They wanted the money so they could run away and become professional dancers, working the jazz halls of Australia. And this is the picture that was taken while she was in police custody. At this stage, she was only a suspect. She hadn't had her day in court. She's got her court papers in her hands there. But when you do research into her story, it also leads you into a wider context around flappers and young women like Edna, a teenager at this stage, she's 19, being influenced by the newspapers, by the magazines they were reading, by the movies they were seeing, to dream of a different kind of lifestyle to the one that she had here in Sydney. So that wider context of what was happening with young women during the 1920s can feed into the way we understand this essentially criminal image. when using these kinds of images, as I said, I really think it's important to provide that kind of context around them. So this is a shot of the Underworld exhibition, which is currently touring around Australia. And I was interested in looking at our collection and then seeing how those stories of crime came out and how they then responded to the wider sort of social context, in this case of the 1920s. So in the Sign of the Times, for instance, I identified lots and lots of men in our photographic collections wearing badges that indicated they'd returned from war, that they were servicemen. And I was interested in what their stories were and what the different stories were, whether we could find examples of PTSD amongst these men, whether we could find examples of criminality, and how perhaps their war experience had changed the path that their life went down. And so we're able to tell lots of those kinds of stories by doing that research, not just telling the story of the individual, but of how society impacted on them and how their actions impacted on society too. Crime stories can also give people inspiration to do all kinds of different interpretations. So this is an exhibition that we held a few years ago called Wicked Women, in which the artist Rosemary Valadon took a feminist perspective on how women had been portrayed in pulp fiction, how criminal women had been portrayed in particular, and created this really thought-provoking work, which again is something that I love about working with crime histories, the way that people take those stories. Some of them are deeply personal, sometimes they create things like that, like this exhibition, which was totally enjoyable and unexpected and really thought-provoking. Just going to finish up with one last kind of point about working with crime history. I'm going rogue, a little bit off topic, just to sort of begin to think about vicarious trauma and how working with these kinds of histories impact on us as historians and as human beings. You know, as historians, we're supposed to be impartial and unemotional, but working with these kinds of histories and objects and pictures and doing research into this and the cultural material associated with it can impact on us. And I suppose in many other disciplines, psychology, in the COPS and in archives indeed, there's a lot of sort of thinking around how we can provide self-care when working with these kinds of collections, but also look out for each other. And it's something that I've been thinking about a bit and just wanted to raise today. But I'll stop now and pass it back to Rachel.
Thanks so much, Nerida. So much there to think about, especially around the complexities of the subject matter of tonight. And now it's great to be able to introduce Andy. So Andy is a senior lecturer at the University of New South Wales and has an extraordinary record of work on really fascinating interdisciplinary projects, and some of those will be discussed tonight. Andy's, of course, now a chief investigator on an ARC discovery project, Australian Violence, Understanding Victimisation in History. And we'll just slip into that Andy was a David Scott Mitchell Fellow at the State Library of New South Wales back in 2011. Thanks so much, Andy.
I was indeed a David Scott Mitchell Fellow, where I first developed some of the tools that I'm going to be talking about today for the study of capital punishment in that instance there. Thanks so much for Rachel for that introduction, and thank you so much to Nerida for your thoughts on the Justice and Police Museum. I've visited that museum so many times now and seen almost every exhibit that you mentioned there, and also now taking my university students there. And so I'm really interested in those reflections, particularly around the visual presentation of crime material. So my background is as a historian as well. I trained in history and did my PhD in history, but for about the last 8 years or so, I've worked in criminology departments. So criminology being the contemporary study of crime, of criminal justice and of its causes. And so I teach in criminology, both historical criminology as well as contemporary criminology. And one of the things that I am really passionate about in my work, which has been mostly my personal research on sexual and gender-based violence, so that's my major research area, is thinking about how we can use the past to understand, to explain, and to learn about contemporary crime problems. So what legacies are there of the past that remain today in contemporary criminal justice systems or popular understandings of crime? And how can the past might actually be able to teach us about a better system that we could put in place, or about a policy that may well have been in place 100 years ago, and how that worked out. Did it work out well or not? And in fact, one of my colleagues on the prosecution project that I'll talk about in a moment has been doing some research on 1919 Spanish flu and border closures during 1919, and Mark Finane's doing some work on thinking about what happened to people who were criminally charged for crossing the border then. So hoping to report on that soon. Okay, so the two things that I'm going to talk about today is one instance where I sought to reconstruct Australia's crime histories, so I kind of hit my historical work, and another instance where I've sought to think about how we can heal from past trauma. So being a criminologist and doing crime history. And the second example, I'll just talk about it briefly now, is thinking about hate crimes against the LGBTIQ people in Sydney. And so during the 1970s, from the 1970s, 80s and 90s, there was a spate of different bashings and killings, predominantly of gay men and transgender women. And the image that I've got there for you is proposed 6 designs of the Bondi Memorial at Marks Park. And this image here is the memorialisation of those historical hate crimes, and they're being voted on by the public, so the public's got a say in how they want those types of historical crimes remembered and memorialised. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Okay, so the main work that I've done over the past kind of 8 years is being involved with a group of researchers at Griffith University called the Prosecution Project. And the Prosecution Project is a large-scale Australian exercise which seeks in part to unlock many of the criminal justice records from all states. So a major part of the project that we sought to undertake was to transcribe all the records, all the registers of Australian higher court proceedings in every Australian state. And so now over the lifetime of that project, now almost 8 years on from its inception, we have done that, and we have a register now, or numerous registers, of about 500,000 crime records. And so I'm going to talk a bit about the process of creating those databases, and particularly the process of our engagement with public in creating those databases and our use of public volunteers to help us create that historical data. Because the project was so large in terms of transcribing 500,000 records, and we were only a project team at the beginning of 3 people, we sought very early on to try to engage public in terms of their interest in transcribing and engaging in Australia's criminal past. And we found it actually quite easy to find people who were really interested in volunteering their time to work with us on this project. We ended up over the life course of the project having between 300 and 400 volunteers from all around Australia and a couple of international people. These often came from previously established archive groups or local historical societies, sometimes people that were involved in family history themselves, Some people had a legal background, which made them what we called our super transcribers, because they were familiar with a lot of the legal terminology used at the time in these historical registers. And I'll just show you an example here of what I'm talking about. These are the kind of registers or the kind of records that we transcribed 500,000 of. So they were familiar with the notations and what it might have meant in a legal sense. We also had a very large group of people from a Western Australian regional area called Carnamah, who were a local historical society, and there was about 40 of these people, and they would meet once a week or so in a room all together, and they would transcribe these materials. And they in fact kept on transcribing so many that we almost couldn't keep up with them in terms of giving them the records to help us with. And so because our engagement with public was taking on such a large part of this project, we began to think really seriously about what it means to be a contributor to Australian historical research. And we called these people citizen historians, much in the way as this kind of crowdsourced volunteer labour effectively is used a lot in science. They're often called citizen scientists in that field, where, for example, a lot of the things to do with astronomy couldn't be done just by a group of researchers in one hemisphere. It takes literally thousands of people all over the world who volunteer their time to identify different aspects of the galaxies, and that's how a lot of the research in astronomy is designed and works. And so we sought to kind of model some of these aspects in our projects. It also meant that we had a lot of people come to us after finding a member of their family in our records. And because one of the main things that we're transcribing is names, and for people doing family history, names are the most important thing that you can look for. We had people coming to us wanting to know more about who they had found in terms of their ancestors. They might have found their ancestor in our records. They might have also found the ancestor as a victim of crime using Trove. And so they would often ask us not only for the records, but I was asked a lot for the context. Can you tell me what it meant to be, for example, the victim of child sexual assault in the 1890s? What did it mean to be an unmarried mother in a particular context? What did it mean to be a victim of domestic violence? And I think one of the, difficulties that people had was recognising, I think, what they assumed to be in some ways a safety of the past, and that certain types of offences, perhaps something like child sexual assault, they might have thought were more prominent today, and those kind of things didn't happen as much in the past. And so I found that there was quite a kind of disconnect, and I think a little bit of a belief system shift, I guess, for people, understanding that these crimes not only did they happen in the past, but they were prosecuted in the past. Child sexual offences made up about 50% of the prosecutions for all sexual offences for the majority of Australian history. So this wasn't a crime that was necessarily silenced in all instances or unknown. And I think for people that had found themselves or their families involved in cases like that, much like Nerida was saying, I think they found a lot of catharsis in actually finding the details. I've been contacted by a lot of relatives over the years of people that I've either talked about in my research or they've thought I might know something about their history, and they often want to know just where can I find the records, where can I find more information about victimisation. And I often have to tell them, well, you kind of have to prepare yourself for what you're going to come across in those records, and that's part of, I guess, the duty of care. And that's one of the things that we thought about a lot, I guess, with using volunteer labour here too, is what is our duty of care in terms of asking people to transcribe information that could potentially be traumatic. We found generally that our volunteers wanted to find out more information about cases. So they went off and searched Trove and were doing huge case descriptions often for us, far more so than had been asked for, I guess, or that we were expecting from our side. One of the challenges that we're coming up against now, it kind of similar but related challenges to what Nerida was talking about the representation of data, is I think when you're working with really big data, like 50,000 or even 40,000 records, it's really difficult to represent a longitudinal crime story in anything but a graph. Yet graphs are so depersonalized, they reduce really complex instances of crime, of violence, of trauma, of colonization, to a tiny little dot point. And in fact, this tiny dot point here, this huge spike in 1908, and this is all of WA higher court records, this huge spike related directly to colonisation in WA, where there was a massive increase in prosecutions of cattle stealing, of homicides involving Indigenous people, and effectively a kind of mass incarceration of Indigenous people, particularly in regional WA, that removed those people from their from country to carceral facilities. And so that is what this dot represents. But I often struggle with this, just I guess in terms of representing the data. So how can we tell that really complex story in something other than a line graph that reduces things down to just a point on an algorithm. Some of the ethical issues that we dealt with as a project, similar to what Nerida was talking about there. So we know that some of our records contained names, some of them contain photographs. If you look on Trove, you'll identify victim information, and we actually collect in fields that are only visible at the moment to the researchers, victim names. One of the things that I guess we probably didn't work out as a team, and a lot of people had very different views on this, was whether we should release names publicly or whether we should de-identify all data. So in a way, I think it's really useful to have these names released publicly, and they are released publicly on Trove, and they are released publicly on Ancestry and on the archives and in numerous other places where people are identified by name. It's really useful for family historians, but also on the other hand, we've effectively created a very big criminal register that you could go and search to identify anybody's criminal history. That has a lot of implications for protection of privacy, and people's job security, etc., and people having a past that they may well not want known, probably for good reasons. So I guess we thought through as a team what we were going to do with this, and we ended up basically just taking the archives. We took the broadest kind of view of the archives privacy legislation around it, and have mostly not released anonymised data within the last 100 years. But that was something that there was really strong opinions opposing that view within the project team that basically said this is public data and it should be able to be released. So I'm interested actually on your thoughts about that as well, and how we can engage with histories that are actually useful for those victims' families to know the name, but also potentially not useful from an identification perspective. So shifting focus here, so that's the work that I do that's primarily historical. And this is an example of how I try to use historical research to engage with contemporary crime problems. So a kind of criminological engagement with history. And this is something that's been going on for the last 2 years in the New South Wales Upper House. New South Wales Legislative Council has held now 2 rounds of an inquiry into effectively healing historical violence, so into hate crimes against the LGBTIQ community. And in Sydney, these were hate crimes that were not adequately dealt with at the time. So this is from mostly the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s. And so I gave expert evidence at these inquiries as a historian of this topic. I also contributed to 2 joint submissions as a historian, as an expert. One of the submissions was with a national group called Australian Hate Crimes Network. and the other one was with a group of criminologists. And the New South Wales inquiry is in response to an ACON report, which I've just put for you there, in pursuit of truth and justice. And this is documenting this history where there is still to date at least 30 unsolved deaths of gay and transgender people who were killed as a result of hate crimes. So at the time, police didn't pursue these deaths. Some of them were written off as suicides or as accidental deaths. You might know the case of Scott Johnson's, probably the most famous case in this group. Scott Johnson's death that was ruled a suicide at 2 coronial inquests until the 3rd coronial inquest in 2017 finally deemed it a hate crime. There was a $1 million reward offered for any information that might lead to an arrest in the case of Scott Johnson, and there was a breakthrough in this case just in May 2020 this year. And these historical crimes, much like Nerida was saying, this isn't past that's long gone. This is people that are very much still alive, other victims of hate crimes there. And it's also communities outside of that, communities that feel that that they were treated unjustly in the past, unjustly predominantly by the state, but also by society. And so how do we heal and deal with that historical violence? I know I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'll just kind of go over this quickly because I imagine this group knows a little bit about this, the background to this. So if we're thinking back on how the police dealt with these crimes historically, and the reason why police would have turned the other way from investigating hate crimes in the 70s, 80s and 90s, well, that has to be understood within the context of when homosexuality was a criminal offence. In the 1950s, the New South Wales Police Commissioner Delaney describes homosexuality as Australia's greatest menace. As arrests of homosexuals are really increasing in the 1950s, there's also more and more allegations of really damning police practices, practices that involved entrapment or false allegations or blackmail. And these often, like these are court cases, offering really serious challenges to police integrity. And so through these kind of cultures of surveillance and police corruption that relate to the treatment of gay men and LGBTIQ communities, this continues through 50s, 60s and 70s, culminating in the 1978 police response to the first Mardi Gras, which led to protesters being bashed. It led to people being named in the newspapers, potentially leading to loss of employment and to vilification of those people. And the police and the New South Wales Parliament actually apologised for their response to, as I've just noted this here, apologised to their response to the first Mardi Gras in 2016. And from about the 80s onwards, police have worked really hard to try to repair their relationships with the LGBTIQ communities through things like liaison officers, through community policing, through trying to engage in community activities. But have these been successful? Well, alarmingly, I think the distrust and the lack of confidence in police amongst LGBTIQ people is still very much part of everyday life. In fact, these aren't relics of the past. And I'm talking about here on this slide that these past injustices are still known by young LGBTIQ people. So these people who didn't have first-hand contact with police in the 70s, 80s and 90s. Yet within criminology studies, these people say they are the least likely to report an instance of a hate crime to police. And they say this is because they believe that police are going to be homophobic or transphobic in their response to them. And so this is just an example, I think, of some of the really important contemporary effects of historical violence, of historical crime, and the kind of impact that that it has, not just on the individuals that are involved in those cases, but on the community overall. So on things like trust in police. And so just finishing here by thinking about how we can achieve justice for historical crimes. And what does that mean for us trying to achieve justice in the case of something like these historical hate crimes? And I've got a number of different strands there that are happening right at the moment in terms of trying to redress these crimes. So we've got the apology that happened in relation to the first Mardi Gras. We've also had apologies in a number of different states for the criminalisation of homosexual offences. We've had expungement schemes be put into effect so people can have that removed from their criminal record under various conditions. We've also got things like the Bondi Memorial, so that kind of community memorialisation and community inclusion in something like the memory of those experiences. We've got the truth seeking from things like the state inquiry that's going on at the moment. And from that, we're hopefully going to be able to produce that kind of system reform that would lead to things like primary prevention programs against hate crime. Or one of the things that I'm trying to do with a colleague at ACON and another colleague at UNSW is to create a kind of restorative justice program where we bring together representatives of these different communities. So for example, police or representatives of the state, victims groups and other community leaders to actually talk about how can we create a mediation session that might help to redress some of these harms. So that's all for me, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Andy and Nerida. Terrific presentations from you both. And I really personally appreciated how you both touched on the idea of how these collections, these records, don't necessarily come with a narrator, and they can be really confronting for people engaging with these materials for the first time if they're looking for answers, and the important role that historians can play in connecting people to those histories and the context around these individual crimes. Now, we do have quite a few questions coming through. So you both touched on the idea of the line, and Nerida, you said that quite specifically. You talked about the line that we shouldn't cross, and Andy, you mentioned past traumas and how we sort of navigate around those spaces. So the first question is, are there particular criminal cases or particular types of crimes that you would not go out of your way to research or engage with? Nerida, if you want to maybe go first.
There are, and it's been an interesting reflection for me. When I was younger, when I was in my 20s, there were certain crimes that I really felt uncomfortable about. You know, the sort of serial killer, single woman being stalked by a serial killer, you know, getting to the front door, can you get your keys out fast enough? Those kinds of things I wasn't really interested in. Now, as a mother, I find cases that involve children to be more difficult and things that I'm less likely to want to have a look at. In particular, infanticide is something that I kind of shy away from a little bit.
Andy?
Yeah, for me, someone once said to me, how does such a happy person deal with such horrible things? Talking about myself. And I find that I am, my research is really driven by a desire to understand violence, to understand how it exists kind of in the human condition, how it manifests in society. And so I have probably of most people that I know, at least in terms of historians, have dealt with the most horrible crimes, have found, you know, like Nerida would find as well in her work, weapons that have been used to kill children in archives. When I found that one day, I had to go home from the archives after finding that. I was so upset about that. Particularly the kind of forensic evidence, I think, often gets to me more. And has had an interesting conversation actually with a colleague who deals with interviews with survivors, so with survivors of violence. And he said he actually finds the text things worse than the interviews, because at least with the interviews you feel like you're engaging with a human, whereas the text is so depersonalized. And I often have in my mind the victim or the person who is the most vulnerable when I'm writing about cases. And you would have noticed in this presentation today, and almost always when I do an oral presentation, I don't talk about cases in a lot of detail because I don't want to engage in that kind of narration or storytelling aspect of that, because I think it can just ethically it's kind of problematic.
So this is an interesting question about collections and records. So somebody's asking about how before smartphones, almost all crimes were never captured at the time that it was happening, and asking how this idea of people filming crimes as they unfold, how does that change the way you would curate a criminal exhibition or study these records?
I think the whole sort of smartphone generation, people recording crimes. I think, we saw tonight, people recording the death of a rapper on a street in Queensland. I find that quite difficult. Generally, the types of crimes and the criminal behaviours that we talk about at the museum, we've allowed a period of time to pass. And I'm not quite sure how we will deal with smartphone evidence going forward, because you become a witness when you view that, and you have very specific kinds of responses to it, which perhaps you wouldn't have to a newspaper report from a journalist who sat through the trial of a bushranger in the 1860s. So something for us to grapple with, I think.
I guess something I would add to that is thinking about these questions about ethics and the questions that both Nerida and I were raising about names and about whether it's ethical to name people. I think it's something odd that I've noticed engaging with criminologists is that criminologists seem a lot less concerned about this in terms of naming people currently than we actually feel about naming people in the past. In that, I mean, you could turn to any newspaper and read names of offenders as well as victims, and that when criminologists reproduce this and write about a case study, they name people as the name. So it's a kind of an interesting aspect that actually us as historians seem to be, and I do it too. I always anonymise my sources and the cases that I've dealt with, but in some ways protecting the past in a way where the present is actually not protected, and partially because of so much information on the internet, we could not protect it in that way.
Although naming historically, I mean, it's an ethical minefield. We do name people. Often the major crimes that we're dealing with, people can find the information online, but also from the experience with some of the families of victims of crime who want the name spoken, who want that recognised. This happened, it mattered, it hurt, and it should be part of the public record. And not everybody, but we do find that that's one of the trends. Even putting images relating to a person's murder up online, some of the families really feel strongly that this is something they want. They want people to know what happened, and they want that to be part of the record. And with cold cases and unsolved crimes in particular, for there to still be a focus, for there still to be this sense that this person's life mattered and an outcome is still possible and should still be sought. Again, we deal with historical crimes. There's, legislation as well as, closed periods around documents, 70 years generally around many of the crime documents. So it's older stuff, but people still feel strongly about their relative and search for justice.
Yeah, I think
that's
that's
a very neat
true.
Segue. Sorry. Into the next question. Somebody's actually asking quite specifically about cold cases, which you've mentioned, Nerida. Now, you've come across quite a few, Andy, and the question is also specifically around coronial inquests, which you mentioned. And yes, these things are often the public record, although often not immediately. But where would people look if they are trying to engage with these cold historic cases?
Depends when, because the coronial inquests are so huge that the state records only still carries a very small number of much older coronial inquests. So I think they only carry 10% or something like that. They've culled really significantly the coronial inquests in New South Wales. So was that kind of what the question was asking?
Yeah, and I think people are just sort of potentially wanting to know where you might go. Like often people think well, I would go to Trove, or I might go to my local studies collection or my closest state library. But are there other resources that you would turn to when you're doing your own work?
Yeah, so I would do it in probably in that order. So I would use prosecution project material first, and I would look at the prosecuted case. Then I would go to the newspapers and I would create a kind of case description around that for myself. And then if I wanted to do even more in-depth research, I'd go to archives. And I do it that way predominantly actually for speed, because I'm often dealing with so many thousands of cases for a particular research question. So I can get a sense of the arc across it, which I think is one of those issues, I guess, that I was trying to raise between dealing with really big data and dealing with particular cases of interest. And that you have a lot more availability to like time to engage with the details of cases if you're looking at things from that at the case level.
We've got lots of people this evening sharing their family histories and criminals they've found in their own trees, victims of crime. I'm not going to skip over those because I think they're unimportant, but I'm just a little bit conscious of time. So I'll try and catch a few more specific questions before we have to end this evening. This is quite an interesting question, and you've both touched on this a little bit tonight already. Why do you think so much crime history focuses on violent crime when actually that's only a small component of the overall number of and types of crimes committed?
Why do I think that we do? I mean, I think that in Australia, predominantly crime history has been in the 19th century, and a lot of it's been around the convict era. And so that idea of the kind of brutal convict, like the fantasy of the brutal convict colony, I think has really influenced the kind of histories that we've written, particularly around things like execution or capital punishment, which I started with. And that we know really a lot more about that early kind of period that is known for that kind of violent brutality than we do about later. I mean, it's an open question actually to what proportion of cases actually involved violence. So I would say it's actually probably more like a third of cases would involve some form of violence, whether that was what the charge was or not. So because we don't have things like victimisation surveys up until the 50s and 60s and 70s, we don't really know about that dark figure of crime that's there outside of the prosecuted cases.
Did you want to comment on that as well, Nerida? Perhaps like the audiences that you see through the different exhibitions and the different styles of exhibitions that you have?
Yeah, I think for some people violence is so outside of their experience. So when they read or see, you know, objects relating to horrendous violence, it sort of sparks that questioning in their head, like, why would you do this? What kind of person would commit this crime? What were the impacts on the victim and on society? So it's almost like it's, you know, something so far removed from most of our everyday experiences, particularly those really violent crimes like, you know, gun crime, knife crime, that I think it sort of does exercise people psychologically. You know, what is this? Why did this happen? What were the consequences? Yeah, I think that's shock value.
I am very conscious of time, so I'll just let you both know that lots of really great comments coming through. Thank you both for your work and appreciating how difficult it certainly can be and how overwhelming it must be on occasion. Lots of people are sharing their own experiences. One really interesting comment is from somebody who's made the point that some particular types of crimes are intergenerational. So understanding these crimes has a really powerful and in some instances life-saving impact on people if they can understand those histories, even those personal histories, as well as the broader context of those for their own safety and well-being. So people are saying they're very grateful for the type of work that you're doing, and that someone has to do it, even though Nerida made that comment at the opening that it's not a history that everybody can do. So before we close off, and I thank both Nerida and Andy, a couple of obligatory advertisements. If you would like some more histories of crime, Nancy Cushing, who was a Merriweather Fellow at the library back in 2014, has just launched an online course, Casing the Joint, Introductions to Histories of Crime, and it's a free online course that you can enrol in. It's presented by FutureLearn and the University of Newcastle, so you can ask Mrs. Google for more details about that and you'll find it quite easily. If you'd like to look at some more data visualisation and play around with some of the ideas that Andy was talking about earlier this evening, Brett Tweedy has just launched on the State Library of New South Wales DX Lab website. So Brett's a data visualisation expert and digital designer. He has harvested 20 million words from the New South Wales Police Gazette, 1860 to 1900, and he's been playing around with how we can see some of the very serious crimes and elements of those crimes that we've been talking about this evening to some of the less controversial crimes, such as when the first bicycle was stolen in Stanmore in the late 1800s. And of course, there will be History Matters again next month, the first Wednesday at 5:30. So that's the 2nd of September. And it is, of course, History Week. So we have quite a different program for you next week. Instead of a themed episode, two historians will be talking about quite different areas of history. Emma Dortons will be talking about Aboriginal country and public spaces in urban areas and the importance of those and the rich history of those places. And Mark Dunn will be talking about the complicated space between heritage and history and how the roles of architects and historians can, let's call it, overlap for the time being. But more about those two stories next time. In the interim, please thank Nerida and Andy. They've gone to so much trouble to bring you these great presentations tonight. Thank you so much. See you next time.